A year after the deadly floods in the Texas Hill Country, a state lawmaker believes Camp Mystic was made out to be a scapegoat, accusing his fellow lawmakers of weaponizing an investigation into the camp. Tonight, what he's saying, and an East Texas lawmaker on what that investigation uncovered.
The goal here is not to limit or to shut down summer camps, but to make sure that they're safe.
State Senator Brian Hughes was part of a committee that investigated the tragedy at Camp Mystic. He talked about what they found on the most recent episode of East Texas Politics on East Texas Now.
At Camp Mystic, there were plenty of adults who loved those children, who wanted to help, but they didn't know what to do. They weren't in the right place. We know now that a detailed written plan will prevent that.
But State Rep Wes Virdell, who represents Kerr County, criticizes the report, accusing politicians of scapegoating Camp Mystic.
I think there's some influential families that convinced Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick to focus in on Camp Mystic, and I think that's unfair. That the investigation committee looked at only 27 and really 28 deaths out of 119 in the county and over 130 for multiple counties.
Virdell believes the legislature overreacted and is now punishing camps.
I think that it ignores that there was, it was probably a 1,000-year flood that came through. It was 15 feet higher than the 100-year floodplain. These camps had never seen water at these cabins before. They're 140 yards from the river.
In the report, lawmakers defend their decision to focus on Camp Mystic, writing, while the tragedy at Camp Mystic loomed in the background, none of the 2025 hearings were focused on what happened there, why so many lives were lost, and whether there are specific lessons to be learned.
It's about making sure that we put rules in place, processes in place, so this doesn't happen again.
And while several laws were passed in response to the flood last year, Senator Hughes says there's still more work to be done.